Talking with me in a moment is a man who's been described as the high priest of atheism. He's an evolutionary biologist who's popularised the gene-centred view of the theory of evolution. And he's also the scourge of fundamentalists everywhere who are outraged by his uncompromising denunciation of religion as mere superstition. I'm intrigued to learn how his inquiring scientific attitude sits alongside his atheistic certainties. For the next hour, I'll be talking to him about that and other matters, in confidence. Can you remember the time when you believed in God?
I was confirmed in the Church of England at the age of about 13. And it lasted for about another 3 years after that, I suppose, till I was about 16.
How did you feel? Do you remember any of the sensations? You went to church, you participated in services?
It was difficult not to, being sent to a sort of very middle-of-the-road Anglican set of schools. It was just accepted. Everybody got confirmed. Everybody was an Anglican. There were almost literally no exceptions. It just felt fairly normal. I think I began to have doubts a little bit earlier than that when I realised, I think my mother kind of pointed out to me, that there were lots of different religions and they couldn't all be right. They were entirely arbitrary whether the one you happened to be brought up in was the right one.
You didn't have any rapturous moments? I mean, because you didn't sort of go along and pray and sort of feel, gosh, I'm in tune with the Almighty.
Actually, I kind of aspired to that. At the time when I was being prepared for confirmation, I used to kind of fantasize about getting visions and things like that, and would imagine myself stealing down to the chapel in the middle of the night and being visited by an angel and things like that. I don't know whether I really believed that that sort of thing ever happened, but there was a sort of brief moment, yes.
Do you feel that you were indoctrinated by your own parents?
Far from it. My parents never. School, no. I mean, the only approach to it came from school, because my parents were not religious and are not religious. But at school, I suppose it was accepted. There was never any doubt about it. I mean, God was there and Jesus was the Son of God and so on. I wouldn't call it indoctrination in the sinister sense that you might get at perhaps a Roman Catholic institution, or even worse, a madrasa. It wasn't indoctrination in that sense. The Anglican version of the virus is a fairly benign one, really.
But what about, because you used the word indoctrination, you would use it, to characterise what goes on in all faith schools?
No, because I think that some faith schools, religion is kind of there in the background, but it's not systematically pumped in the way that it obviously is in some of them. So I don't think we'd want to use the word faith schools in a kind of blanket damning way for all of them. But there are certainly some in which children are taught, this is your religion, this is what you believe, all other religions are wrong, and that, I think, does deserve the word indoctrination, and it certainly does happen in quite a lot of schools.
I mean, you particularly hate the idea, don't you, of labelling children in the name of their faith.
I've got a thing about that, because it's so sort of strange when you think about it, and people instantly get it when you point out that you would never talk about a postmodernist child or a Keynesian child. And yet it's exactly the same thing. I mean, the child of a Keynesian economics professor would not be called a Keynesian child. It would not be automatically assumed that the child had inherited the economic beliefs of his father. But yet in religion, that's the one place we almost all, buy into that. It's almost all of us accept. You see newspaper headlines about Catholic children and Protestant children in Northern Ireland, as though there is such a thing as a Catholic child or a Protestant child.
But I wonder if one needs to get quite so worked up about it. I mean, if I talked about a Jewish child, for example, I'd be a sort of like a shorthand way of referring to their parents.
That's right. It's an interesting grey area, because similarly, you don't mind talking about a French child or a German child. Jewish child, I think, is a sort of intermediate case, because there is such a strong cultural identity there. And so many of my Jewish friends are atheists but still call themselves Jews. And you can kind of see why. It's a kind of loyal identification with an ancient tradition. I think I'd probably do it myself. And in a way, I think of myself as a sort of cultural Christian, cultural Anglican, in the same kind of way. But I do think it's important to make a distinction between that and what you actually believe. And when people talk about a Catholic child or a Protestant child in Northern Ireland, then I think it is presumption to think that this child, because it's called a Catholic child, believes that the Virgin Mary is whatever it is, the Queen of Heaven, and literally was assumed into heaven and died a virgin, that kind of thing. A child is too young to commit itself to that kind of thing.
But you're very strong on this. I think that you've actually said at one time, unless you've been misquoted, that almost that it is worse than physical abuse.
Well, I didn't quite say that. What I said was that teaching children that they'll roast in hell could under some circumstances be worse than physical abuse, in the sense that it might last longer. And in the same context, I quoted a woman who wrote to me from America, who as a child, at the age of 7, had been physically abused by her Roman Catholic priest, nothing unusual there, but also a friend of hers, also aged 7, had died, and she was told by the same priest that this friend had gone to hell because she was a Protestant. And my correspondent from America said that of these two kinds of abuse, the physical abuse was the less damaging than the mental abuse. The physical abuse by the priest she soon got over. It was just yucky.
But that's a very hard case, isn't it, Richard? I mean, most people's experience of growing up, even if they grow up in Catholic families, if they grow up in Methodist families, is that they're told these stories, and don't children sort of believe and half-believe and reject?
I'm very curious about that. I'm very interested in the things that children believe and the things that they don't. I mean, when you think about it, as a child, you're fed all sorts of Grimm's and Hans Andersen fairy stories about sleeping beauties and frogs turning into princes. And you're also fed stories about God and about Father Christmas. And somehow children usually get off the ordinary magic spells of fairy tales, and they get off Father Christmas. They don't get off God. And there's something a bit different, and I don't quite understand what it is. Children do seem to have some capacity to filter what they're told and to work out, well, that's obviously not really true, but it's a good story. But and I wonder whether it's to do with the seriousness of the tone of voice that's adopted by the adult who's telling you about it. I mean, on the face of it, there should be really no difference between being told that Jesus turned water into wine and that a witch turned a frog into a prince. I mean, they're both impossible magic tricks. But on the one hand, we have no misgivings. I mean, the child is not literally going to believe that frogs turn into princes. On the other hand, we expect a child to believe that Jesus turned water into wine.
Perhaps you'll see, in my experience, I was brought up in a Christian Brothers school, very, very strict Catholic background. When I was a teenager there, all the boys were questioning the stories they were told. How do you get to heaven, they'd asked. And I wonder if you sometimes rule out the possibility of this kind of questioning which children naturally do.
Obviously I don't, because many people, just about all my friends, for example, have weaned themselves off it, and you have, and I have. Clearly, it very often happens. But equally, you can't deny that an awful lot of times it doesn't happen, and people go to their graves believing this stuff. And so it clearly is a persistent, and I would say pernicious influence on many people, if not all.
See, the things that one of the things you're talking about are the stories that are told. Children are told stories about, frogs and princes, these types of stories. But I mean, children love stories. I mean, those stories help them to understand the way the world works in many ways, don't they?
What I would like to do, I think, is to see some research done, some psychological research on childhood development and the influence of fairy stories, what it is that somehow manages to differentiate frogs turning into princes from water turning into wine. There does seem to be a difference, and I'm not sure what it is, and I'm wondering whether it's the seriousness of the tone of voice in which you're told it.
But there are moral lessons contained in many of these fairy stories, aren't there? They are ones in which people, Cinderella or something like that, is the story of someone who really is rather sad and neglected and put upon, who eventually triumphs. And the religious story is rather like that as well, isn't it? They are comforting stories. They provide a certain degree of comfort. But you don't like the word comfort very much, do you?
Well, no, I mean, I think that's fine, and I think you're quite right that there are moral lessons to be learned from all kinds of stories, from just ordinary novels, from just ordinary fiction as well. But I do think it's important to keep in mind that certain things really do happen and other things really don't happen. It's not trivial whether Jesus walked on water and whether, because, I mean, you and I don't believe that, but a lot of people do. Nobody who's an adult believes that frogs turn into princes. But I think all I'm saying is it would be an interesting piece of research to do, to study the influence of fairy stories of all kinds, and I include Jesus fairy stories as well as frogs and prince fairy stories, stories that are anti-factual, I wouldn't say counterfactual, anti-factual, anti-scientific, but yet may have value in enhancing imagination, may have moral value.
Seems to me you're going to leave people awfully alone if you do this. I mean, I'm thinking I went along to a recent weekend at which there were humanist celebrants, the people who go along and speak at funerals where the relatives have indicated they don't wish to have a religious funeral. And I said to them, what do you do about those relatives who talk about heaven, who say, well, you know, he's gone to a better place, or she's now enjoying herself, she'll have met up with her brother. And the people I spoke to said, well, we don't want to interfere with those because those are comforting stories. This is a time of great stress. It's not our job to interfere. But you sound as though you might want to interfere.
No, I would never interfere like that, no. I mean, I'm very happy to let people, if I meet a dying person, I wouldn't go out of my way to disillusion them out of that. But no, I mean, I don't want to hurt people's feelings or anything like that. I do care about what's true, and if somebody wants to have an argument with me about what's true, that's one argument we can have, and it doesn't move me if somebody says it isn't important what's true. And I've even met people who say, well, who cares what's true? I mean, what matters is what's good for the human condition, or what comforts people, or what provides a good poetic metaphor for something or other. I mean, I'm all for poetic metaphors and things, but I'm also interested in what's true. And let's separate these things out and make it quite clear, OK, just for the next half hour we're talking about what's true, and now we can talk about comfort or whatever you like, but let's confuse the two.
But yet you see recently, again, I see reports that you produced a rather hostile reaction to the comedian Peter Kay's announcement that he believed in religion because he found it comforting.
No. That was a rather unfortunate episode, actually. I never heard of Peter Kay, and somebody just phoned me up, and instead of saying, sorry, I know nothing about that, put the phone down, I said, well, who is Peter Kay? And they said, well, he said something about what matters is being comforted or something like that.
Yes, something along those lines.
And so I said what I just said to you. Well, I think that what really matters is what's true.
You were misquoted because he did say something.
I wasn't misquoted, but I was out of context and didn't know anything about the issue.
Now, I can understand your reaction against fundamentalism because it excludes other non-religious forms of thought, especially in schools. But your own Anglican education didn't seem intolerable to you. Yet you seem as though you still want to bring your attack to bear upon those who are given a religious education, even though it might have the liberality manifested by your own religious education.
No, I think that. For one thing, I come back to the point that the fact that many of us do manage to escape from this is no argument, because many don't, and so that's the first point. I think that the next point is that so much of religious education actually is rather more pernicious than I think you ever had. It only takes a minority to take it really seriously when they grow up, and it can be extremely dangerous. Obviously, the vast majority of Muslims in this country, and indeed in the world, are nice, peace-loving people, but their holy book and their whole religious teaching teaches them things like apostates should die, infidels should die. If you die a martyr, you go to a special corner of heaven.
But you know that most of them don't believe that.
I know that most of them don't believe that. But that's no defence, because it doesn't take most of them in order for horrible things, suicide bombings and things, to happen. You only need a minority to say, I really believe this stuff. What you're saying is, oh, we needn't worry because most people don't take their religion seriously. Well, I'm glad they don't take their religion seriously, but it only takes a minority to take their religion seriously. And the majority who go along with religious education and people like you, if I may say so, who say, well, there's no harm in it because most people don't believe it, you are making the world safe for the minority who really do believe what they're taught.
Well, because when you attack moderates, then you say that really moderates do create the circumstances under which fundamentalism can exist. Is that a reasonable paraphrase?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
But don't you risk, by doing that, alienating the moderates? Because you could have moderates on your side against fundamentalists. But if, in fact, you are attacking the moderates for opening the door to fundamentalism, you lose them.
It's a very difficult problem, and I'm constantly trying to balance this. It's a very difficult juggling act. Do you try to get the moderates on your side, or do you try to say you're making the world safe for the fundamentalists? And from day to day, I vary. I wish the moderates would come out a bit more. I mean, I would love to hear moderate Muslims, for example, who instead of carefully and quietly getting on with their lives in an inoffensive way, which of course most of them do, why don't they stand up and condemn the fundamentalists? And the reason, one possible reason, is that in order to do so, they would have to disavow aspects of their own faith. I mean, they are taught the Quran is the literal word of God. So in a way, the fundamentalists are the true ones who are really following the faith. They're the ones who actually take it seriously. So what we're asking the moderates to do is to say, I don't take my faith seriously, and nor should you. It's a difficult thing to ask them to say.
But you say that you wobble on this, that you are uncertain, that you go from day to day. I mean, you quite enjoy spending time with, I'm thinking of a moderate like the Bishop of Oxford, for example, with whom you get on really rather well.
Yes.
I mean, here's a moderate Anglican you get on well with. You don't you don't suggest that he opened the way for fundamentalist evangelical Christians.
He's a delightful man, and so is the Archbishop of Canterbury, and so is every bishop I think I've ever met. And in this particular case, when I've collaborated with the ex-Bishop of Oxford, Richard Harris, I think on a couple of occasions, over this infamous school in the north of England at Gateshead, which teaches fundamentalist Christianity, the world is only 6,000 years old and things like that. He and other bishops are as outraged by that as I am. And there is an absolutely textbook case where cooperation with moderate Christians entirely makes sense. And that's what I do, so yes.
I mean, institutional religion, because this is, to me, sometimes your concern with how moderates might be allowing the fundamentalists to get in, perhaps directs the attack against institutional religion. But you have spoken about faith schools, or about, say, the role of religion in the British Constitution, in the British state. I mean, I would have thought it's those areas. We've just had a report from, for example, from Ireland on sexual abuse and the way in which the state and the bishops there hushed this up. These seem to me to be immediate and present dangers that one should be firing at.
Absolutely, yeah.
You'd agree with that?
Absolutely, yeah.
Because there's a certain sense in which if you, I want to argue about this, because if you presumably would be very much strongly in favour of doing something about disestablishing the Church of England in this country. You'd be wanting to take the bishops out of the House of Lords. You'd be wanting to end the close association between the Church of England and the British Constitution.
Yes, I think I would. I mean, it's my only hesitation. You detect hesitation in my voice. My only hesitation is when you think of the alternative, and I mean, as I said, the Anglican version of the virus is a very benign one. It's a bit like the metaphor of vaccination. You give a weakened dose of the strain as a vaccination against the really virulent one. So I occasionally wonder whether a decent moderate church is a kind of defence against the howling hordes of
So you wouldn't prefer to have a situation such as in the States, such as in the United States, where religion is kept separate from
I
the
would
state?
actually, yes. I mean, I said I was hesitating, but when the chips are down, I would prefer to see no bishops in the House of Lords. I mean, worst of all is when people use the fact that the Anglican Church has some kind of privilege to say, oh, we want those privileges too. If we have Anglican bishops in the House of Lords, why shouldn't we have Roman Catholic bishops too? Why shouldn't we have mullahs and imams in the House of Lords? I mean, that's the worst of all possible worlds.
But there's not
so
a thing
let's get
here,
rid of
isn't
all
there?
of them.
But when you do hear people say, oh, look, religion should be taken away from the state, it should be no part of it. Let's adopt the American example. But peculiarly enough, if you go to America, where in fact there isn't any state sponsorship or state legitimation of religion, it's a highly religious country.
Exactly. I mean, it may not be that peculiar, and it's been often suggested that it's the very reason, because religion is separated from the state in America, religion has become free enterprise and has become, these vast mega churches with preachers doing a kind of pop rock star act, and with bands and dancing girls and adventure playgrounds for the old age pensioners and things like that, all in the same building, and mega churches vying with each other for not only congregations but the vast amounts of tax-free money that comes flowing in from these people. In a way, the established church in Britain is a kind of immunization against that, because in Britain religion is just boring. At least Christian religion is just boring.
But how is it? How is it in the States? Well, you'd have thought there are more and more people going through higher education, more and more people, we might say, who are becoming increasingly literate and sophisticated. Religion is still so strong.
I know,
I mean, is it just the Barnum and Bailey effect? That you're...
There's one born every minute, you mean that? Yes. I am baffled by it.
You've been there, you've gone around.
No, there's no question about it. I don't know what your sense is. Mine is that America is almost splitting into two species. I mean, there's the sort of the educated ones who don't take any part of this, and then there's a kind of the Sarah Palin tendency, which actively resents intelligence, education, and feels looked down upon, rightly one might say, but it translates itself into a kind of political movement of resentment. And I think that fundamentalist Protestant religion, at least, tends to flourish under that kind of group paranoia.
Now, what we've seen is that the death of religion, widely forecast, but it hasn't occurred. Now, I'm interested in the way this fits in with memes. And can we just talk a little bit about this? This is the idea you introduced some time ago as a sort of complementary cultural feature to genes. Now, what exactly did you mean by memes?
Well, I wouldn't wish to exaggerate the importance of that. I mean, I introduced this in the last chapter of The Selfish Gene, and the whole of the rest of the book was about genes.
Oh, yes, absolutely. But this applies specifically to religion, doesn't it?
Well, yes, but my purpose was not to make a contribution to the study of human culture. It was rather to make a contribution to biology, in the sense of saying that if you want to understand natural selection, I've emphasized genes throughout this book, but genes aren't the only thing. Natural selection will work anywhere in the universe where you have a self-replicating entity. And a gene, as a bit of DNA, is the most obvious example of that. But maybe there are others, and I just threw out the idea of a meme as a way to illustrate this. But
what you meant by a meme was an idea, a set of ideas, wasn't it? I mean, religion might be...
Well, the important thing is that it must, like a gene, be copied with perfect accuracy, or almost perfect accuracy.
But you could, in the same way that you could have species, animals with maladaptive features, which then died out, to put it very crisply. So in the same way, there were certain cultural ideas of which religion was one,
yes,
which also could be expected to die out when it no longer served any adaptive functions.
I don't think the biological analogy is helping in this case, because the idea of a meme, if it's analogous to a gene, would not be a whole religion. It would be a particular idea
in a supernatural being,
yes, which is defined in such a narrow way that it could be said that when it passes from one brain to another, it passes unaltered. And so it would have to be a much smaller thing than a religion. It might be the idea that you survive your own death or something of that sort, or the idea that Mary was a virgin for the whole of her life. These would be examples of things which could pass from brain to brain to brain to brain without being changed on the way. And so a religion would be a meme complex. It would be a whole kind of ecosystem of memes.
Well, let's come into another angle then. But haven't you indicated at times that religion could be seen as something which once had adaptational functions? It provided something that was needed for people at a particular time, but now no longer did that. And I seem to remember that it somehow had persisted. It had persisted, even though it no longer worked. I think your analogy was with a moth, the idea that there was a time when it certainly made sense for moths to be oriented towards light sources, but moths that flew into candle flames.
That's right. The idea of the analogy is that before humans had artificial light sources, before there were electric light and candles, the only light sources at night were celestial.
Yeah. So the religion was simply was like a perverse form which had gone lingering on.
Yes, I mean, I would stand by that, but I wouldn't wish to go along with you in using it as a sort of that the benefit was for humanity or something. It would have been that individuals in our ancestral past benefited from not religion per se, but from psychological predispositions which could manifest themselves in the form of religion. And the analogy with the insect is that the predisposition is the rule of thumb that's built into the insect's head, which says maintain a fixed angle to a light source, which works when all light comes from infinity, which it does if it's celestial objects, but no longer works in the case of candle flames. So the analogy there would be something like obey authority, believe your parents whatever they tell you. And that would be something that in a wild state could be extremely valuable, because parents have information about how to survive in a dangerous world, which the child doesn't have. And so the rule of thumb, analogous to the insect one, believe whatever your parents tell you, works. But then, when the parents start telling you nonsense, superstitious nonsense, then the child brain has no way of distinguishing. It comes back to our earlier conversation about how children distinguish. I'm postulating the child's brain would have had no way of distinguishing the dire warning which the parent gives, don't step in the fire, whatever it is, don't jump over a cliff, from the nonsense, which would be, bow down to the great juju in the sky or something.
You seem to think that today there's an increase in enlightenment, in rationalism, in reason, but I wonder how you reconcile that against what seems to be an increase in the number of people who subscribe to a religion.
There has been a sort of shift, even in the last few decades, let alone back to the 19th century, when, say, T.H. Huxley, Darwin's great champion, was right in the vanguard of progressive thought, and yet the things that he said about black people, for example, would be appalling by
But aren't your examples,
standards.
just a little bit selective? Because, OK, you might talk about the way in which, say, homosexuality, you might talk about the improvements in women's rights, but then I might have to confront you with, Hiroshima, I might have to confront you with the Holocaust, I might have to confront you with the Gulag, and say, here we have mass killings on a scale which would be unimaginable in the Middle Ages.
Of course, but I mean, surely the simple answer to that is that in the Second World War, and since they have had technology which was undreamed of in the Middle Ages. I mean, just imagine if Henry VIII had nuclear weapons. So you can't blame everything about the Second World War on the horrible, evil people who did it. You have to say that they also had the tools to do horrible things.
But, I mean, if you consider, say, Nazi Germany, I mean, here you have a very large proportion of the population. These are members of the new enlightened human race, or the increasingly enlightened human race, who appear to subscribe to a program of mass genocide against...
Absolutely horrible, of course. But, I mean, subscribing to racist genocide would have been commonplace in earlier centuries. But in the Germany of the 1930s and 40s, they had modern technology, they had high-speed railways, they had gas, they had chemistry, they had guns, they had weapons, they had the whole infrastructure, the whole ability to put into practice on a vast, hideously vast scale, things which in an earlier century would have been taken for granted as what people wanted to do. They just didn't have the tools to do it with the same ruthless efficiency that the Germans had.
And of course what the Germans did, but they did it in the name, really, didn't they, of science. I mean, this was the science of genetics.
Oh, no. This was a hideously misapplied science of genetics and absolutely no basis in scientific genetics at all.
Well, it was, you might say misplaced, or you might say hideous, but I mean, we can't deny that there were, for example, in this country, eugenic societies and others who favoured sort of introducing breeding methods which reduced the incompetence.
Yeah. You can make. I mean, what Hitler really did, and the eugenicists did, was to want to put into practice, and in Hitler's case, began to put into practice a scientific theory which was known to work on animals and had been done for years on non-human animals and plants. I mean, there's no question but that eugenics would work if you wanted to breed a master race of
you could do
pole vaulters or something. You could do it, and Hitler had the will to do it. So, I mean, the science was sort of there, but the difference between Hitler and us was that Hitler had the desire to do this kind of thing.
But science provided the authority for it.
It's not the authority. Science, in a way, is saying the same kind of thing as I'm saying when I say that Hitler had weapons at his disposal. He had modern science at his disposal to put into practice what he wanted to do. But you couldn't say that somehow science has a sort of ideological commitment.
No, but isn't there, I just wondered, isn't there some danger that in constantly saying, look, science has the answers, this is where we must go, science is this, that you're increasing the authority of science, and the danger is, if you increase the authority of science, then scientific solutions to this or that problem are going to be the ones that dominate.
Yeah, that is, I mean, I think what I'd say to that is that if you want to do terrible things, science is the most efficient way to do it. And if you want to do good things, science is the most efficient way to do it. Science is just and the technology you derive from science, I should say, is a very efficient way to do whatever you want to do. It becomes all the more important, therefore, to want to do the right things.
How do we know which are the right things to do then? Where do we where do we find values and moral codes which tell us how science should be used?
A very difficult question, and I think we need people of goodwill to sit down together and talk about that, and you're not going to derive that from science, obviously. You might derive from science a kind of toolkit for thinking clearly about it. I mean, if you look at how moral philosophers go about their business, it's not quite science, but it's sort of like science. It's a way of setting out your arguments, looking for inconsistencies, looking for things that don't quite match up together. And so science might help you in deciding what's right and wrong by clearing your mind of fuddlement. So if you're dealing with a moral issue like abortion or something, science might help you to make a distinction between fetuses that are too young to feel
to be
pain,
sentient, or yes.
that kind of thing, and it might help us to rid ourselves of a kind of absolutist morality where we say something like, human life is sacred, nothing more to be said, that's that. A scientific way of looking at morals might say, well, hang on a minute, some sentient beings can feel pain and others are not sentient, so they can't feel pain. What about the difference between a human embryo that's too young to feel pain and a fully grown chimpanzee, which has obviously the capability to feel pain, not just pain, but emotional.
But these are complex arguments that I can remember a survey in which parents were asked why they taught their religion to children, or why they wanted their children to go to religious school. And over again they said, well, they must know the difference between right and wrong. Christianity, well, I mean, other religions, all religions, obviously have moral codes right at their heart, at their core. And let's just take the Christian one for a moment, love thy neighbour as thyself. You know, very sort of simple, straightforward injunction to get on with your fellow human beings, to extend love to them. Presumably you'd have no objection to that,
no, I mean,
that morality.
And presumably you wouldn't for a moment suggest that that is a Christian. I mean, that's an almost universal injunction. That,
I suppose it can be found elsewhere, but it is a central core of Christian religion.
Of course it can be found elsewhere. It can also be derived from sensible, moral, philosophical
But if we agree it's rather a good sentiment, does it matter where it comes from?
No, we can say it's a good sentiment, but why complicate matters by saying it comes from a particular holy book, when in order to get it from that holy book, you've got to cherry-pick your way through the holy book, removing all sorts of unpleasant things, and just pick out this one. So on your cherry-picking way, as you pick out the Sermon on the Mount and say, this is a nice thing, we're going to use that, you've then got to answer, well, then why don't we pick out all the other bits that are horrible? And the answer is because we have a decent, liberal consensus about what is moral that doesn't come from religion. We can retrospectively fit it back to religion if we want to. We can go back to the Bible or whatever your holy book is and say, we'll have that verse because that fits in with our moral code. That verse doesn't, so we'll scrap that. Why bother to go back to the holy book? Why not just stick with your moral code which you've got from somewhere else?
You've attacked religions which claim to be an explanatory system, but surely not all religions do set themselves up like that. They're more interested in exploring, in where we're all going, well, the meaning of life, if you like.
When you use a phrase like meaning of life, I think that in many ways science does actually tell you about the meaning of life, but that you would say is the explanatory domain. And I have a hard time, I mean, we all make our own meanings of life when we think about what our purposes is, what makes us feel good, what makes us feel bad, what we want to achieve, our relationship with loved ones, and so on. The good life, philosophers have worried about that for a long time, and there's no reason why we shouldn't think about such questions in a non-religious way. There are religions who don't, as you say, make any aspiration to explain things, but provide a sort of code for living.
So you'd go easier on those. I mean, you would.
Well, I'm all for codes for living, and it only seems to me to deserve the name of a religion when it starts to encroach upon the territory of talking about supernatural beings and that kind of thing, where it does become a matter of fact.
I always want to stretch you just outside science. I mean, in a way, I'm trying to say to you, look, Horatio, what about philosophy which lies outside science and outside reason? And you've already mentioned, for example, falling in love. Now, this is an area, I mean, would you consider writing a book upon the notion of love, the feeling of love, the sensation of love? I mean, if you did so, presumably you'd have to say this was a very distinctive state which we didn't know too much about, but was a feeling that came over us and absorbed us, made us do all sorts of things that were very unreasonable. You would presumably want
of course. I mean, I am committed to the view, and I'm sure you are too, that something like love is, although it's extremely hard to understand, in principle it's understandable. In principle, it doesn't betoken anything more than neurons firing. But when you've said that, you haven't said very much.
It doesn't feel like
exactly,
neurons.
That's the point. When you've said it's no more than neurons firing, you haven't said anything, because, of course, when you're actually in love, you're not aware. I mean, when you're seeing the colour red, when you're feeling pain, when you're in a hot bath or something, you can know intellectually that what you're getting, what your brain is getting, is nerve impulses from your body. But I mean, it doesn't in any way lessen the intensity of the feeling, whether it's a rather ordinary feeling like feeling warm, or an intense feeling like being in love or like weeping at a Beethoven
By that
quartet.
token, don't you feel that going round telling people that really that they can't believe in God or they must give up their belief in God is a bit like telling people to stop being in love?
Not at all. It's totally different. When you talk about believing in God, you are making a commitment to a supernatural being who exists, who really exists. You can't get away from that.
Well, to a supernatural entity. I mean, not a man in the sky.
Yes,
I mean, religious people...
Entity, not a man in the sky. Something supernatural, something beyond science. Now, I fully accept there's an awful lot that science doesn't understand, maybe never will understand, and love may be among those things. But it's never going to be, if we ever do get understanding of it, it is not going to turn out to be the particular view of a Bronze Age goat herd, which is what we're being asked to accept as the alternative. There will be deep profundities. Sorry, that's a tautology. in our understanding of not only love but all sorts of other things, the deep emotions that we feel with music, with poetry. But for goodness sake, don't let's get people get away with saying, oh, therefore that proves there's something supernatural.
But what did they all say? I mean, you cry when you listen to Schubert, I think?
Yes.
What are you crying about?
An intense internal feeling, which is no doubt very similar to the feeling that a religious person gets. You could call it spiritual. You could call it transcendent. All sorts of these words that people use that don't mean anything. It is a very, very intense...
What do you mean they don't mean anything?
Well, they don't mean that there's something beyond the reality of science. It is all neurons. It's all neurons. But it's neurons deployed in a very, very complicated way. Nerve impulses deployed in a very, very complicated way. We may never understand how that gives rise to such deep emotion that you cry, but we are not saying, and we should not be saying, oh, therefore that means there's a God.
No, all right, but we might say that here is a sensation, here is a feeling which to some extent is inexplicable. I can't explain.
Yeah.
I have to use words like transcendence,
yes,
don't I?
It is, well, at very least unexplained and possibly inexplicable. But if it becomes explicable, then it is highly unlikely to be explicable by the kind of Mickey Mouse theories which we get from things like the Bible.
But I'm at your dinner table. I mean, here I am. And I say to you, I have religious experiences. I have a sort of sense of the ways in which I am one with the world, or the world is this, or I have some sort of pantheistic notion that there's a connection between the rocks and the waves and the mountains and the crags, and that I'm somehow rolled round by cosmic forces. And if somebody says that to you, you might say, are you going to say, well, that's not quite the same as the experience I get when I'm listening to Schubert? You know, that's a little bit towards the religious side of things.
No, I go along with everything
you're happy with that type
Absolutely,
of experience?
Yeah.
You see, I think that many people who are... You see, I have a feeling among the people who find your proselytization on behalf of science and reason to exclude too much. As though people feel part of my experience isn't being allowed in. It's not getting a voice.
It's just a confusion of language. I get all those senses of looking at the stars and the sea and the oneness with nature and all those sorts of things. I get them very strongly. What infuriates me is the jump from that to saying, oh, therefore there's something supernatural. That's all I'm talking about. Let's just use language precisely. There are these deep feelings. The feelings that you and I get as atheists will be exactly as strong as the feelings that religious people get. But you and I have the sense not to graft onto it a supernatural word. That's all. That's the only difference. We get the same intensity of feeling.
Now, you've had to face up to many attacks, but I imagine that you must get a great deal of consolation from people who come up to you and almost follow your analogy that you provided them with a way to come out and, not to come out as gay, but to come out as atheist.
Yes. One of the things we're running is a thing called the Out campaign, which is partly come out. But it's stand out. You using the word out in this way. We don't out people like the gay. Some of the more militant gay people did. We encourage consciousness raising to the extent that people may want to out themselves. And to encourage the feeling of liberation that you get when you come out from under all this baggage of centuries of superstition and realize what a wonderful place the world is and how even more wonderful it becomes when you understand it.
You realize, don't you, that because in recent years you've devoted so much of your time to arguing the case against religion, that your obituaries are probably going to overlook your contributions to science, your development of the count of the phenotype, for example. You're happy about that?
No, I mean, it would be a pity, I think. I mean, I actually don't see a great separation, and I regard science as beautiful, and what science finds as beautiful, the scientific method of thinking, as beautiful. And what I really want to do is to open people's eyes to the elegance and the beauty of the world as seen through scientific eyes. And if religion is a casualty of that, so much the better.